First, Russia granted temporary asylum to the NSA leaker Edward Snowden. Now, a stalemate over what to do about the conflict in Syria. It seems the United States and Russia are increasingly at odds with each other, with some saying relations between the two countries have not been this strained since the Cold War. Joining us now for more on that relationship and what it means for movement on Syria. In Washington, D.C., Angela Stent. She's professor of government and foreign services at Georgetown University and the author of the forthcoming book, The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. And Professor Stent, as I welcome you to the program this evening, I wonder if we could start by having you tell us what you think the U.S.-Russian split over what to do about Syria reveals in terms of a bigger picture of the relationship between these two countries.
Well, good. It's very nice to be here, and it's a great question. So, since the Soviet Union collapsed, we've had a little over 20 years, and we've had, by my count, 4 different resets. So every time a U.S. president has come into office, we've thought that we could find the golden key to improve the relationship, and then usually it hasn't ended well. And so I think we're now on another downward spiral. I would not agree that the relationship is worse. It's worse since the end of the Cold War. I think it was pretty bad in 2008 at the end of the Russian-Georgian War. But I think what it's symptomatic of is we have been unable, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. and Russia, to work out the kind of an equilibrium in our relationship that isn't subject to these highs and lows, and really with more lows than highs often.
I wonder how much of this is sort of false advertising, insofar as we probably thought when the Cold War was over that the two countries were going to agree more often and be able to work things out and find solutions to global problems. Maybe those expectations were unrealistic to begin with?
I think they were. I think the problem was that we thought that the problem in dealing with the Soviet Union was communist ideology. That was part of it, but there was a much bigger issue, and that is that Russians, even stripped of the Soviet ideology, they see the world differently than we do. We thought that immediately they would turn around after communism collapsed and would embrace the kind of system that we in the West have. They obviously didn't do that. So I think that our expectations were wrong. I think that we maybe oversold in the U.S. to the U.S. public about how quickly relations could improve. And I think we've only slowly come to realize what I think Europeans have known for much longer, that the process of change in that part of the world takes much longer. And in Russia's case, could take a century, could take 70 years. But I think we really misunderstood what was happening there in the 1990s.
What do you, I've had a lot of people ask me this question, and I'm not sure I've had a great, I'm not sure I've been able to offer a great answer to anybody. So you're an expert, and I'm going to put the question to you. Russia has been so deeply aligned with Syria on this particular crisis, and I think a lot of people are wondering why. What's in it for the Russians to be backing Syria so forcefully? What's the answer?
Well, I think we have to step back and say the thing that Russia really fears is regime change. And the Russians look back, they see what happened in Iraq, they see what happened in their own backyard, by the way, in Ukraine and Georgia, and they see what happened in Libya. And they believe that that regime change will be very dangerous, not only for the region. They fear instability in the region, and then they do fear the repercussions of instability and of Islamist governments coming to power in that region, the repercussions of that on their own Islamic population within the Russian Federation. They have a lot of problems. Their Muslim population is the most rapidly growing population. Even though the Chechen war is over, there's a lot of unrest there. So I think it's the fear of instability, the fear of regime change. And then Mr. Assad is one of their few remaining allies in that part of the world. They have a warm water port there in Tartus. They have a good economic relationship with Syria. They've been selling them arms and other things for a very long time. And I think the prospect of Assad departing and the unknowns, what will happen after that happens, makes them very concerned. And they prefer the regime that they know there, even if they don't love it, than to the uncertainty of what might come next.
The consequence of that, though, is that some would argue that Vladimir Putin looks completely indifferent to the slaughter of 100,000 people that is taking place and which he appears to be content to let continue to happen. Why isn't he concerned about that?
Well, I think he's more concerned about absolute sovereignty, about disagreeing with the United States and other Western countries about the principles of humanitarian intervention. That's much more important to him than the human suffering. And I have to say, the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, to the United States gave a briefing this morning where he said that, as from the Russian point of view, and Mr. Putin has said that, they believe that the chemical attacks that were carried out earlier this year were carried out by the opposition. So I think one of the Russian answers to that would be, well, there is human slaughter going on, but how do we know who's responsible for it? But again, I think their major focus is on not promoting instability there and on preventing regime change, having stability. And even though there is a human cost to that, they would say, well, it's a civil war. What can you do?
All right, let me follow up on something that you said actually a few minutes ago in your first answer, which is you estimated this was the fourth reset since the end of the Cold War between Russia and the United States. Do we assume that because the two countries are so offside with each other's positions on the Syria issue, that this reset has run its course and we need yet a fifth now?
Well, first of all, I do think this reset has run its course. I think in the first Obama administration, it accomplished quite a lot. We had a New START arms control agreement. We got the Russians to agree to tougher sanctions on Iran. We agreed with them on a northern distribution network to transport people and goods to and from Afghanistan. They joined the World Trade Organization. So I would say we accomplished quite a lot with Russia. But that reset was really negotiated by President Obama and then President Dmitry Medvedev, a man of Obama's generation. And apparently the two presidents got on rather well, even though we know that nothing could have been agreed on without Putin's sanction. Now that Mr. Putin is back in the Kremlin, I think that the U.S.-Russian relationship has become more difficult. I think that's because in U.S.-Russian relations, not much gets done unless the presidents agree to it, because we don't have much of an economic relationship with Russia. So at the moment, I would say that reset is over. I'm not sure, however, that we need a fifth reset. I think we in the U.S. at least, need to stand back, as President Obama himself said, take a pause and say we can continue to deal with Russia, and we do on a number of important levels, including counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, non-proliferation, all of these issues. But we shouldn't raise expectations, at least in the United States, that somehow we're going to be able to improve the relationship qualitatively again or in any great way. I think certainly that won't happen for the rest of the Obama administration, and I wonder what would happen in the administration of the next U.S. president. It's not clear that there is room for another reset.
Well, let me follow up on that a bit, too, because I'm sure all of our viewers remember more than a couple of decades ago when Mikhail Gorbachev came into office and Margaret Thatcher famously said, he's a man I can do business with. I don't hear anybody saying that about Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama. In fact, I see Barack Obama saying that, well, we had that very awkward handshake, first of all, in St. Petersburg, and then Obama's referring to Putin as the guy who looks like the kid at the back of the classroom slouching and bored. These two don't seem like two world leaders who are able to get along right now. What does that mean in terms of policy?
Well, I think on the one hand, that's quite right. And I think the remark that President Obama made about President Putin being the kid in the back of the classroom slouching, that was quite a remarkable thing to say. But both of them, both Obama and Putin, have said that when they talk about concrete issues, they can get things done. So they can, if need be, work together. They did meet together on the sidelines of the G20 summit. They apparently spent a half an hour together today. So on one level, they will still be working on the issues that we've always been working on with Russia, again, at least for the last 20 years. So I don't want to exaggerate the importance of the personal relationship, but I think to get things moving forward, to get a better atmosphere, then I think you probably would need to have two different people in office, and that's not going to happen for some time.
No, and I don't want to exaggerate either how bad things are between them. I mean, this is obviously not Khrushchev and Nixon, it's not FDR and Stalin, But how many
Right.
years do you want to go back before you can find an American leader and a Russian leader, or a Soviet leader for that matter, who appeared to have such significant personal antipathy to one another, and certainly in public, look very awkward and unable to get along?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think you'd have to go back a long way. I mean, obviously, there was Nikita Khrushchev who canceled a summit with President Eisenhower when the Soviets shut down a U-2 spy plane. But even, with President Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, they seemed to get on quite well, at least, again, if you looked at the body language. With Jimmy Carter, it was maybe a bit more difficult. Reagan, I mean, then you had all the old Soviet leaders who were dying off in the early 80s, but certainly Reagan and Gorbachev in the end got on quite well. So it is difficult to think of another president and a Russian Soviet leader who've appeared to have had this uncomfortable of a personal relationship, and that's what makes it so remarkable. I mean, you mentioned Gorbachev. I mean, under Gorbachev, really most of the Western leaders, both President Reagan and then President George H.W. Bush, really valued him in the end. And of course, President George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, even though by the end of that Bush administration, the second administration, the relationship had deteriorated because of the Russia-Georgia war, they did enjoy apparently quite a good personal relationship, and the chemistry was quite good, at least for the earlier part of the Bush administration.
What was that line Bush 43 said again? I looked in his eyes and got a sense of his soul, or something like that?
And got a sense of his soul. He did say that. He did, of course, in his memoirs write that maybe that wouldn't have been the right thing to have said, but certainly at the time he did. And again, if you want to go back and look at the pictures and the way that the two men interacted, you would see it looks very different from what we see nowadays with Obama and Putin, even though they did shake hands today and smile briefly.
All right, let's, in our remaining moments here, focus once again on Syria. And we know that Vladimir Putin has said, okay, maybe poison gas has been used, but I'm not satisfied that there's adequate proof that the regime is responsible for using it. And in fact, he called the Secretary of State in the United States, John Kerry, a liar, which is something, that's a pretty heavy word to throw around as well. What kind of evidence do you think the Russian leader needs that would convince him that Assad was in fact involved in this somehow?
Well, I mean, what the Russian leadership is saying is that, first of all, they want to wait and see what the United Nations inspectors say when they make their report to them. And they say they would need incontrovertible proof, and they say they don't have that. And again, they say they have proof that the other side was using chemical weapons, that the rebels were. So they would need to have some, I guess, independent commission of inquiry say that without a doubt we can tell you that all of this was done by the Syrian government. So in a way they're making almost impossible demands because I think it would be very difficult to come forward with that kind of proof. But that's what they're saying. And I think in the absence of that, they're saying that they wouldn't support any United Nations Security Council resolution on using some kind of force in Syria, and it's going to be then up to the United States and whatever other coalition of the willing there is to go it alone, and they are warning that there will be consequences. Now, when we asked the Russian ambassador today, could you be specific about that, he wasn't. But that's what you're hearing from officials, that there'll be consequences, but we don't know what they are.
Could you fill in the blanks? You don't have to speculate, but looking at, if past behavior is any indication, if the Americans act unilaterally here without, as clearly will be the case if it happens, a good housekeeping seal of approval from the Russians, what do the Russians do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look back, they complained a lot about Iraq, but they didn't do anything. They were very angry about what happened in Libya, since they abstained from that resolution. But again, they didn't do anything. So I doubt that we're going to see any kind of military response. But I think to the extent that there might be more instability in the region, you might see Russia playing a more active role there. I mean, they have 8 of their ships going there, but I think at the moment, I think that would be to evacuate because they have quite a lot of Russians who live in Syria. So I wouldn't expect a violent reaction, but there could be repercussions that we, at the moment, have a hard time envisaging.
The United States and Russia, once upon a time, were talking about putting together some kind of peace summit, if you like, in Geneva in hopes of getting more focus on the Syrian issue. What's the status of that effort?
Well, I think that's completely in abeyance now. I mean, the problem with that particular issue is who represents the opposition at these talks. I mean, I think the Syrian government, before all this happened, said that they're willing to take part in these Geneva talks. But then who's the other side? And how do you agree who comes from the opposition to make it any kind of legitimate discussion? And I think the Russians are saying that they still support this, but only if there's an open mind about what happens afterwards, not with the presumption that the result of these talks is going to be that Assad himself will have to go. So that's still a stumbling block. But at the moment, I would say this is all on hold until we see the outcome of if there is a U.S. military action.
One thing I haven't asked you yet is your read on this situation in Syria. Do you think the United States should strike in Syria as a response to the use of poison gas in that country?
Well, I think the problem here is, and this is a question that many Americans are asking also in the Congress, what is the goal of this? What would it accomplish? And do we have a plan for what happens next? If we go in and do this, what happens after that? And I think I would have said that in the absence of a clear idea about what happens afterwards, and maybe in the absence of more diplomatic efforts that could be made, I would think that the administration should think very, very carefully before going ahead and striking Syria.
Would a negative vote by Congress automatically end any attempt to strike in Syria?
Well, I don't think it automatically ends it, but I think it makes it even more difficult for the White House to justify doing that. And that's obviously why they want the support. But on the other hand, if they really believe they have to do something, I suppose there are ways of getting around it. But I think it would maybe at least cause more of a delay in taking any action.
But having said that, there was a long list you gave us earlier in our conversation about the things that the United States and Russia are actually working on together. Is there any threat that if the United States goes ahead with its strike, that Russia will no longer play ball on those issues that used to be of mutual interest?
Well, I think most of the issues that are of mutual interest are sufficiently important to Russia that they would continue to play ball. I mean, they themselves are concerned about nuclear nonproliferation. They're certainly concerned about what's going to happen once U.S. and NATO forces have withdrawn from Afghanistan in 2014. And they are concerned about Iran. I mean, it's possible that on the Iranian issue, they could maybe not support any more sanctions, but then they haven't supported any more sanctions, for quite a few years. So most of the things where we're working with them are in their interest too, and they would have had to have decided at that point that it's more important to make a stand against the United States if they withdrew their cooperation. But they might be more difficult to work with.
That's Angela Stent from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We're very grateful you could spend some time with us on TVO tonight, Professor Stent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.